The first gunshot nearly made Pearl Ferguson faint, even though it was a mile away. She pressed her small frame against the rough-hewn wall of the general store in Mineral Park, Arizona Territory, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. It was 1881, and at 20 years of age, Pearl had survived enough violence to last several lifetimes. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to steady her breathing. No matter how hard she tried, her voice remained trapped in her throat, coming out only in the faintest of whispers when it emerged at all. "Miss Ferguson, your order is ready," Mr. Wilson, the shopkeeper, announced, his booming voice making her flinch. Pearl nodded and approached the counter, eyes downcast. She reached into her pocket for the carefully counted coins, placing them on the counter with trembling fingers. "Everything all right with you, Miss Ferguson?" Mr. Wilson asked, concern etching his weathered face. Pearl nodded quickly, her lips forming the words "thank you," though barely a sound escaped. She gathered her small parcel of supplies, flour, coffee, and a bit of sugar, luxuries she rarely afforded herself, but necessary for the visitors coming to the boarding house where she worked. As Pearl stepped out onto the dusty street, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mineral Park. The small mining town was growing rapidly since silver had been discovered in the nearby hills, bringing miners, merchants, and miscreants alike. The street bustled with activity as Pearl made her way back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, where she had lived and worked for nearly 8 months. It wasn't much, but after fleeing her uncle's home in Kansas, it was the closest thing to safety she had known in years. Another distant gunshot made her clutch her package tighter. Though shootouts weren't uncommon in Mineral Park, they still sent terror through her slender frame. Pearl quickened her pace, nearly colliding with a tall figure rounding the corner. "Whoa there," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her, preventing her fall. Pearl's eyes widened as she looked up far up into the face of a stranger. He wore a trail-dusted hat and had the unmistakable look of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. "My apologies, madam," he said, releasing her arms immediately when he saw her discomfort. "Didn't mean to startle you." Pearl clutched her package to her chest, shaking her head to indicate no harm done. She tried to speak, but as usual, nothing more than a whisper emerged. "It's fine," she mouthed, hardly audible. The stranger tilted his head, his blue eyes curious beneath the brim of his hat. "Pardon, I didn't quite catch that." Pearl's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to try again when Mrs. Holloway's voice rang out from down the street. "Pearl, there you are, girl. I've been looking all over. We've got new boarders coming." The stout woman hurried toward them, her face flushed from exertion. The stranger tipped his hat. "Madam," he greeted Mrs. Holloway before looking back at Pearl. "Miss Pearl, is it?" "Pleased to make your acquaintance," he smiled, revealing a straight set of teeth unusual for the frontier. "Ethan Quincy. I believe I might be one of those new boarders your employer mentioned." Mrs. Holloway caught up to them, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Quincy, I see you've met my assistant. This is Pearl Ferguson. Don't mind her quietness, she's hardworking despite her peculiarities." Pearl lowered her eyes, her shame deepening at Mrs. Holloway's tactless introduction. "No peculiarities that I can see, madam," Ethan replied smoothly, causing Pearl to glance up in surprise. "Just seems like a thoughtful lady who doesn't waste words like some folks I know." Mrs. Holloway huffed, clearly not sure if she'd been insulted. "Well, follow me then. Pearl, bring those supplies and start on supper. We've got 4 new boarders all here for the railroad survey." Pearl nodded, stealing another glance at the tall stranger Mr. Quincy as they walked toward the boarding house. He caught her looking and offered a small smile that made something flutter in her chest. The boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building, one of the larger structures in Mineral Park. Inside, Pearl hurried to the kitchen, setting her packages on the large wooden table before removing her shawl. She could hear Mrs. Holloway showing the new boarders to their rooms upstairs, her voice carrying through the thin walls. Pearl began preparing the evening meal, a beef stew with the last of their vegetables. As she worked, she tried not to think of Mr. Quincy's kind eyes or the way he'd defended her to Mrs. Holloway. Men like him didn't notice women like her, not really. And even if they did, they certainly wouldn't stay interested once they realized she could barely string two audible words together. Her silence hadn't always been her companion. As a child in St. Louis, Pearl had been known for her cheerful chatter and singing. But that was before her parents died of fever when she was 12, before she'd been sent to live with her uncle in Kansas. The memories of those years still haunted her dreams and had stolen her voice as surely as if someone had cut it from her throat. As Pearl stirred the stew, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. A moment later, Ethan Quincy appeared in the kitchen doorway, ducking his head slightly to enter. "Something smells mighty fine in here," he said, his voice warm. Pearl nodded her thanks, keeping her eyes on her task. "Mrs. Holloway said you've been here a while," he continued, seemingly unbothered by her silence. "I'm here with the survey team for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. We're mapping a route through to California." Pearl looked up briefly, offering a small smile to show she was listening. "Not much of a talker, are you?" Ethan asked, though there was no judgment in his tone. "That's all right. My mother used to say still waters run deep." Pearl's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and turned to face him. "I can speak," she whispered, so softly he had to lean closer to hear. "It just doesn't come out right." Ethan's face brightened. "Well, I'm mighty pleased to hear your voice, Miss Ferguson, however it comes out." The sincerity in his eyes made Pearl's cheeks warm. She turned back to the stew to hide her reaction. "Need any help?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. Pearl shook her head quickly. Mrs. Holloway would have a fit if she found a boarder working in the kitchen. "All right then," he said, not pushing the matter. "But I'll be staying a few weeks at least. Perhaps we'll have other opportunities to talk." He gave her another warm smile before leaving the kitchen, and Pearl found herself hoping his words would prove true. Over the next few days, Pearl observed Ethan and his fellow surveyors come and go from the boarding house. Unlike the other three men who spent their evenings at the saloon, Ethan often remained at the boarding house, sometimes reading by lamplight in the small parlor or writing letters at the dining table after supper. 4 days after his arrival, Pearl was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she heard a commotion from the street. Curious, she made her way to the front of the house just in time to see a group of miners confronting Ethan and another surveyor. "We don't need no railroad coming through here, taking our claims," one of the miners shouted, his face red with anger and whiskey. "The railroad's not interested in your silver," Ethan replied calmly. "We're just charting the best route through the territory." "That's what they all say," another miner spat. "Then the big companies come in and push the little men out." Pearl watched with growing anxiety as the confrontation escalated. When one miner shoved Ethan hard, she gasped, the sound barely audible even to her own ears. To her surprise, Ethan maintained his composure, neither drawing the pistol at his hip nor returning the aggression. "I understand your concerns," Ethan said, straightening his vest. "But fighting me won't change the railroad's plans. If you've got grievances, put them in writing. I'll make sure they reach the company directors." The miners seemed taken aback by his reasonable response. After a few more muttered threats, they dispersed, leaving Ethan and his colleague in the street. Pearl retreated to the kitchen before they could see her watching, but her heart raced with admiration for Ethan's calm handling of the situation. Most men she'd known would have reached for their guns at the first sign of disrespect. That evening, Pearl was clearing the supper dishes when Ethan lingered at the table, waiting until the other boarders had left. "Miss Ferguson," he said quietly, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." Pearl paused, a stack of plates in her hands, and nodded hesitantly. "I noticed a small library in the parlor. Do you ever use it?" Pearl set down the dishes and whispered, "Sometimes, when my chores are done." "Do you enjoy reading?" he asked, his eyes brightening with interest. Pearl nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I brought some books with me, including a new novel by Mark Twain. Perhaps you might like to borrow it." His offer seemed tentative, as if he feared she might refuse. Pearl's eyes widened. Books were precious commodities on the frontier, and new ones were rare treasures. She nodded eagerly, forgetting her usual reserve. "Yes, please," she whispered, a little louder than her usual tone. Ethan grinned. "Excellent. I'll bring it down tomorrow." He rose from the table, then paused. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Ferguson?" Pearl tensed but gave a cautious nod. "Has your voice always been so soft, or—" He left the question hanging delicately. Pearl looked away, her fingers twisting in her apron. After a long moment, she whispered, "No, it changed. After." Ethan didn't press for details, which only increased her appreciation for him. "Well, I think there's something special about a voice that makes people lean in close to hear it," he said gently. "Makes a man pay better attention to what's being said." With that, he bid her good night and left her standing in the dining room, her heart fluttering in a way it never had before. True to his word, Ethan brought down Twain's The Prince and the Pauper the following evening. Pearl accepted it with reverent hands, whispering her thanks. Over the next few days, she found herself reading late into the night by candlelight in her small room at the back of the house, treasuring the story and the thoughtfulness of the man who had shared it with her. A week passed, during which Ethan and Pearl developed a quiet routine. Each evening, he would find some excuse to speak with her alone, asking about local geography, sharing observations about his day's work, or inquiring about her opinions on the book she was reading. Pearl found herself whispering more words to Ethan than she had spoken aloud to anyone in years. On Sunday afternoon, Pearl had a rare few hours to herself. Mrs. Holloway had gone to church, followed by a social at the Reverend's house, and most of the boarders were out enjoying their day of rest. Pearl sat on the back porch, mending one of her 2 dresses when Ethan appeared, dressed in clean trousers and a fresh shirt, his hat in his hands. "Afternoon, Miss Ferguson," he greeted her. "It's a fine day." Pearl nodded, setting aside her mending. "I was wondering if you might accompany me on a short walk," he said, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "There's something I'd like to show you if you're amenable." Pearl hesitated. She rarely ventured beyond the boarding house except for necessary errands. The thought of walking through town with Ethan, exposed to curious eyes and potential judgment, made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Seeing her hesitation, Ethan added, "It's just to the edge of town. Won't take but 30 minutes of your time." Pearl took a deep breath and nodded, rising to fetch her shawl. When she returned, Ethan offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand lightly on his forearm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his shirt. They walked in comfortable silence through the less populated streets of Mineral Park. Pearl was acutely aware of the occasional curious glances from townsfolk, unused to seeing the silent boarding-house girl in the company of the handsome surveyor. At the eastern edge of town, Ethan led her up a small rise that overlooked both the settlement and the rugged landscape beyond. When they reached the top, he pointed to a flat boulder. "Perfect spot for a rest, don't you think?" he suggested. Pearl sat on the sun-warmed stone while Ethan remained standing, gazing out at the view. The afternoon light bathed the desert in golden hues, highlighting the distant mountains in shades of purple and blue. "I've been all over this territory," Ethan said, "but there's something special about this particular spot." He turned to look at her. "The first time I climbed up here, I thought to myself that this view deserves to be shared." Pearl smiled, genuinely touched that he had thought to share it with her. "Miss Ferguson Pearl," he said, using her given name for the first time. "May I ask how you came to Mineral Park? It seems an unlikely place for a refined lady such as yourself." Pearl looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. No one had asked about her past since she'd arrived in town, and she had volunteered nothing. The thought of explaining, even in her whisper, made her throat constrict painfully. Ethan seemed to sense her discomfort. "Forgive me," he said quickly. "It's not my place to pry." Pearl shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It's all right." She took a deep breath. "I came from Kansas after my uncle." She trailed off, unable to continue. Ethan sat beside her on the boulder, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You don't have to tell me," he said gently. Pearl stared at the town below, gathering her courage. "He was cruel," she finally whispered. "After my parents died, She swallowed hard. "He didn't like the sound of my voice. Said I talked too much. When I spoke, Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. Ethan's expression darkened with understanding and barely controlled anger. "He hurt you when you spoke," he concluded quietly. Pearl nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "For years," she whispered. "Until I learned to be silent, then She couldn't bring herself to describe the other abuses she had endured. "I ran away last year, took a train as far as my money would go, ended up here." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me with that, Pearl." He looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "No one should ever silence another person that way. Your voice, however soft it may be, deserves to be heard." Pearl wiped away her tear, oddly comforted by his righteous anger on her behalf. No one had ever defended her right to speak before. "Sometimes," she admitted in her whisper, "I try to speak louder, but nothing comes out, like my voice is broken." "Not broken," Ethan said firmly. "Just hurt. And hurt things can heal, with time and care." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. As they walked back to the boarding house, Pearl felt lighter somehow, as if sharing even that small part of her burden had lessened its weight. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan found reasons to spend time with Pearl whenever his work allowed. He brought her wildflowers he'd found while surveying, shared stories of his travels throughout the West, and always listened attentively to her whispered responses, never asking her to speak up or showing frustration with her soft voice. Pearl found herself looking forward to their moments together, with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She knew Ethan's work in Mineral Park was temporary. He had mentioned moving on to California once the survey was complete, but she couldn't help the growing affection she felt for the kind surveyor who treated her with such respect. On a warm Tuesday evening, Pearl was in the kitchen preparing preserves from the last of the summer berries when she heard shouting from the street. Moments later, the boarding house door burst open and 2 of Ethan's fellow surveyors rushed in. "Mrs. Holloway," one called out, "is Quincy back yet?" The landlady emerged from the parlor, frowning at the commotion. "No, I haven't seen him since breakfast. What's the matter?" "There's been a cave-in at the Silver King mine," the man explained breathlessly. Quincy went to survey the area this morning. No one's seen him since the collapse. Pearl's hands froze on the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the berries. A cold dread washed over her, and the kitchen suddenly seemed to tilt. "We're gathering men to help with the rescue," the surveyor continued. "Thought he might be back by now." Mrs. Holloway shook her head. "Lord have mercy. How many are trapped?" "At least 5 miners, maybe more. And possibly Quincy, if he was inside when it happened." Pearl set down the spoon with trembling fingers and moved toward the door, her heart pounding. Mrs. Holloway noticed her movement and frowned. "Where do you think you're going, girl?" she demanded. Pearl opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, not even her usual whisper. She gestured toward the door, her eyes pleading. "You'll stay right here and finish those preserves," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. No place for a woman at a mine disaster. The surveyors left, and Mrs. Holloway returned to the parlor, leaving Pearl standing in the kitchen, her chest tight with fear. For several minutes she remained frozen, torn between obedience and the desperate need to know if Ethan was safe. Finally, Pearl untied her apron and hung it on its peg. She slipped out the back door and hurried toward the Silver King mine on the north edge of town. Her skirts gathered in her hands as she half walked, half ran along the dusty road. By the time she reached the mine, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the frantic scene. A crowd had gathered near the mine entrance, where men were removing debris and shouting instructions to one another. Women stood in small groups nearby, some crying, others praying, as they waited for news of their husbands, sons, and brothers. Pearl scanned the area anxiously, looking for any sign of Ethan. Not seeing him among the rescuers or the bystanders, she felt her dread deepen. "They've been at it for hours," a woman beside her said. "My Henry's in there. Been mining 15 years without a scratch, and now this." Pearl wanted to offer comfort but could only manage a sympathetic nod. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, casting eerie shadows across the scene. Pearl waited, hugging herself against the evening chill, watching as one by one, miners were brought out, some walking, some carried on makeshift stretchers. With each emergence, cries of relief or renewed grief rose from the waiting families. Nearly 3 hours after Pearl's arrival, a commotion at the mine entrance drew her attention. 2 dust-covered men emerged, supporting a third between them. Even in the dim lantern light, Pearl recognized Ethan's tall frame. His face was blackened with dirt, and blood matted his hair on one side, but he was alive and moving under his own power, albeit with assistance. Pearl pushed forward through the crowd, all her usual timidity forgotten in her relief. When Ethan saw her, his pained expression transformed into one of surprised joy. "Pearl," he said hoarsely as she reached him, "what are you doing here?" She took his dirt-streaked hand in both of hers, unable to form words even in her whisper. "I'm all right," he assured her, wincing as he shifted his weight. "Just a knock on the head and a twisted ankle. Others weren't so lucky." Pearl's eyes filled with tears as she realized how close she'd come to losing him. Without thinking, she reached up and brushed dirt from his cheek, her touch feather light. "Let's get you looked at by the doctor," one of the men supporting Ethan said. "That head wound needs attention." As they began to lead him away, Ethan held onto Pearl's hand. "Will you come with me?" he asked, a vulnerability in his voice she'd never heard before. Pearl nodded and walked beside him to the doctor's small office, where several of the injured miners were already being treated. The local physician, Dr. Bennett, was moving from patient to patient, his sleeves rolled up and his hands stained with blood and dirt. "Put him there," Dr. Bennett directed, indicating a chair. "I'll get to him when I can. Head wounds look worse than they are usually. Keep pressure on it." Pearl took a clean cloth from a pile on the doctor's desk and gently pressed it against the gash on Ethan's temple. He winced but managed a smile. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice rough from the dust he'd inhaled. "Glad, though." Pearl returned his smile, her eyes conveying what her voice could not. They waited nearly an hour before the doctor examined Ethan, confirming that his injuries weren't life-threatening. He cleaned and stitched the head wound, then wrapped Ethan's ankle tightly. "No walking on that for at least 3 days," Dr. Bennett instructed. "And watch for dizziness or confusion with that head injury. Someone should keep an eye on you tonight." "I'll manage," Ethan assured him, though he looked pale beneath the dirt on his face. Pearl touched the doctor's arm to get his attention, then pointed to herself and then to Ethan, her meaning clear. Dr. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering to watch over him, Miss Ferguson?" Pearl nodded firmly. "Well, that's between you and Mrs. Holloway, I suppose," the doctor said with a shrug. "But he shouldn't be alone, and I've got my hands full here." With the help of one of the other surveyors, they got Ethan back to the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway met them at the door, her expression shifting from anger at Pearl's disappearance to concern when she saw Ethan's condition. "Good Lord, Mr. Quincy, what happened to you?" she exclaimed. "Cave in at the mine," the other surveyor explained briefly. "Doc says he needs rest and someone to watch him tonight." Mrs. Holloway pursed her lips, clearly calculating the additional work and potential impropriety. "Well, I suppose he can recover here. Pearl, make up the sofa in the parlor. We can't be having him climb stairs with that ankle." Pearl nodded and hurried to prepare the sofa while the men helped Ethan to a chair in the dining room. She brought down extra pillows and blankets, arranging them to make a comfortable bed. By the time they settled Ethan on the sofa, he was clearly exhausted, his face drawn with pain. "I'll bring some laudanum for the pain," Mrs. Holloway said, her practical nature taking over. "Pearl, fetch some water and clean bandages." To Pearl's surprise, Mrs. Holloway didn't object when she pulled a chair close to the sofa after Ethan was settled. "Someone needs to keep an eye on him," the older woman conceded. "I suppose it might as well be you since you've taken such an interest, but leave the door open, mind you." Left alone with Ethan in the parlor, Pearl sat quietly, watching the rise and fall of his chest as he dozed, the laudanum taking effect. His face, now cleaned of dirt, was pale, making the dark stitches at his temples stand out starkly. Several times during the night, Pearl dampened a cloth and gently wiped his brow when he grew restless or feverish. Once he woke disoriented, calling out in alarm. "The timbers are giving way," he cried, trying to sit up. "Get back, everyone get back." Pearl placed her hand on his arm, steadying him. "Safe now," she whispered, leaning close so he could hear. "You're safe, Ethan." He focused on her face, recognition slowly returning to his eyes. "Pearl," he murmured. "You're really here," she nodded, gently easing him back against the pillows. "You know what I thought about when I was trapped in there?" he asked, his voice slurred from the medication. "Your voice. I kept thinking I wanted to hear it again, even just a whisper." Pearl's heart constricted at his words. She took his hand and held it as he drifted back to sleep, her own eyes growing heavy as the night wore on. She must have dozed off in her chair, because she woke with a start as early morning light filtered through the parlor windows. Ethan was awake, watching her with a tender expression that made her cheeks warm. "You stayed all night," he said softly. Pearl nodded, smoothing her rumpled skirt. "Thank you," he said simply. Mrs. Holloway bustled in before Pearl could respond, carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits. "Well, you survived the night, Mr. Quincy," she announced. "How's the head this morning?" "Pounding," he admitted, "but clearer." "Good. Pearl, go freshen up and then see to breakfast for the other boarders. I'll look after Mr. Quincy for now." Pearl reluctantly left the parlor, glancing back at Ethan, who gave her a reassuring smile. For the next 3 days, Pearl divided her time between her regular duties and caring for Ethan, bringing him meals, helping change his bandages, and sitting with him in the evenings. Though Mrs. Holloway raised her eyebrows at Pearl's attentiveness, she made no comment beyond occasional reminders about propriety. By the 4th day, Ethan was able to move about on crutches the doctor had provided. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Pearl found him on the back porch, staring thoughtfully at the hills beyond the town. "Your company sent a telegram," he said as she approached. "They want me back in the field as soon as I'm able." Pearl's heart sank, though she had known this moment would come eventually. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I've been thinking," Ethan continued, turning to face her, "about what happened at the mine, about what matters." He took a deep breath. "When those timbers started crashing down around me, I realized I've been wandering too long. Always moving, never staying anywhere or with anyone long enough to build something real." Pearl stood very still, afraid to hope for what his words might mean. "I've spoken with Mr. Hayes at the land office," Ethan went on. "There's a small property available about 5 miles south of town. Good water, decent soil for this region. I'm considering buying it, setting down roots." Pearl's eyes widened in surprise. "But I wouldn't want to do it alone," he said, his voice growing softer. "Pearl, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never met anyone like you. Your strength, your kindness, even after everything you've endured." He paused, gathering his courage. "I'm asking if you might consider a future with me. Not right away, I'd court you proper, build us a home first, but eventually, if you found you could care for me as I've come to care for you." Pearl's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to tell him how much his words meant to her, how she'd begun to dream of a future with him despite her fears. But as always, the words caught in her throat, emerging as barely a whisper. "I already do." Ethan smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "What was that, Pearl?" "I couldn't quite hear." Pearl took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. "I care for you," she whispered, a fraction louder than before. "Very much." Ethan's smile widened, and he carefully set aside his crutches to take both her hands in his. "Then may I have your permission to call on you formally? To court you with the intention of making you my wife when the time is right?" Pearl nodded, a tear of happiness sliding down her cheek. "I should warn you," he said, his tone lighter now. "I'm a patient man, but I have dreams of hearing your voice grow stronger, of hearing you laugh someday, even shout if the occasion calls for it." Pearl smiled through her tears. The thought still frightened her, but for the first time in years she found herself wanting to try. "I'd like that," she whispered, "to find my voice again." Ethan gently squeezed her hands. "We'll find it together, Pearl, however long it takes." In the weeks that followed, Ethan recovered fully from his injuries and purchased the land he had spoken of. True to his word, he began courting Pearl properly, taking her for walks when her duties allowed, bringing her small gifts, and always listening attentively to her whispered words. With Mrs. Holloway's reluctant blessing, Pearl began spending her Sunday afternoons with Ethan, sometimes visiting his property to watch the progress as he built a small but sturdy cabin, other times walking through town or sitting in the church garden. During one such Sunday visit to the building site, about a month into their courtship, Ethan showed Pearl the nearly completed cabin. It was simple but well constructed, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that caught the western light. "What do you think?" he asked, watching her expression as she explored the space. "I know it's not much compared to what you might have had back east," but Pearl shook her head, cutting off his apology. "It's perfect," she whispered, running her hand along the smooth, planed windowsill. "You built it yourself." Ethan smiled, pleased by her approval. "I did have some help with the roof," he admitted. "But yes, mostly my own work. I wanted to build something solid, something that would last." Pearl understood he wasn't just talking about the cabin. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Ethan said, moving to a trunk in the corner. He opened it and removed a small wooden box. "This belonged to my mother. I'd like you to have it." Pearl accepted the box with curious hands. Opening it, she found a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by the gift. "Open it," Ethan encouraged. Inside, Pearl found a tiny folded piece of paper. Carefully extracting it, she unfolded what appeared to be a note written in Ethan's hand. "To Pearl, whose voice, however soft, has filled my heart with its music. With love, Ethan." Pearl's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him, deeply moved by his words. Too sentimental. He asked with a self-conscious smile. Pearl shook her head emphatically. "No," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." Ethan helped her fasten the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin and sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. As they stood close together in the cabin that would one day be their home, Pearl felt a surge of emotion so powerful it momentarily took her breath away. "Ethan," she said, her voice still a whisper but steadier than before, "I love you." His eyes widened slightly at her declaration, and his smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I love you too, Pearl, more than I know how to say." He bent down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Pearl raised her face to his and their lips met in a gentle, tender kiss, her first. When they separated, both were smiling, a new understanding between them. As summer turned to autumn, their courtship deepened. Ethan completed the cabin and began preparing the land for spring planting, while continuing occasional survey work to build their savings. Pearl maintained her position at the boarding house, but spent every free moment either with Ethan or planning for their future together. Under Ethan's patient encouragement, Pearl began practicing speaking a little louder each day. At first, she practiced alone in her room, forcing out words that no one could hear. Then, with Ethan, she would read aloud from books, her voice barely audible at first but gradually growing stronger. There were setbacks, of course. Days when memories would overwhelm her, and her voice would retreat to its barest whisper or disappear entirely. On those days, Ethan never showed disappointment, only quiet understanding and steadfast support. "Your voice will come when it's ready," he told her during one such difficult day. "And if it never comes back fully, I'll still count myself the luckiest man alive to have you by my side." By late November, with winter approaching, Ethan asked Pearl to set a date for their wedding. They chose Christmas Eve, a time of hope and new beginnings. Mrs. Holloway, who had gradually warmed to their relationship, offered to host a small reception at the boarding house following the ceremony. As the wedding day approached, Pearl worked on a special surprise for Ethan. Each night in her room, she practiced speaking the words of her vows aloud, pushing her voice to be heard clearly across the small space. It was painful sometimes, both physically and emotionally, to force her voice past the barrier of fear that had silenced her for so long. But her determination grew with each passing day. 2 days before the wedding, a snowstorm swept through the territory, blanketing Mineral Park in white. The roads became nearly impassable, raising concerns that Reverend Thomas might not be able to reach them from the neighboring town, where he also served on Christmas Eve morning. Pearl woke to find the storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of white. From her window, she could see men clearing paths through the deep snow. Her heart light with anticipation, She dressed in her best dress, a deep blue wool that Ethan had bought for her in Prescott, and carefully arranged her hair. Mrs. Holloway knocked on her door mid-morning. "Pearl, there's someone here to see you," she said, an unusual note in her voice, curious. Pearl followed her to the parlor, where a middle-aged woman in a travel-worn coat waited. The woman turned as Pearl entered, and her face broke into a warm smile. "Pearl," she said, her voice catching with emotion, "you might not remember me. I'm your mother's cousin, Margaret, from St. Louis." Pearl stared in shock at the vaguely familiar face. Distant memories stirred a kind woman who had visited their home occasionally when Pearl was small. "When your parents died, I was abroad with my husband," Margaret explained. "By the time we returned and learned what had happened, you'd already been sent to your uncle's. We tried to find you, but—" She trailed off, pain evident in her expression. "When we finally located your uncle last month, he claimed you'd run away. We've been searching ever since." Pearl stood frozen, overwhelmed by this connection to her past suddenly appearing on her wedding day. Mrs. Holloway, sensing her distress, stepped forward. "Pearl is getting married today," she explained to Margaret, "to a fine young man who's building them a place just outside town." Margaret's eyes widened. "Married, my dear girl, what wonderful news." She approached Pearl cautiously. "I don't mean to intrude on your happiness. I only wanted to find you to make sure you were well, and to tell you that you have family who care about you." Pearl found her whisper then. "How did you find me?" "We've been inquiring at train stations all along the routes west from Kansas," Margaret explained. "A porter in Flagstaff remembered a quiet young woman traveling alone last year. He thought you might have continued to Mineral Park. It was a slim lead, but we followed it." Pearl whispered. "My husband is arranging rooms at the hotel," Margaret said. "Pearl, we want you to know that whatever you choose to do with your life, you have a home with us if you ever need it. We've been searching for you for so long." Tears filled Pearl's eyes at this unexpected gift family who had cared enough to search for her, who had never forgotten her. In a surge of emotion, she stepped forward and embraced Margaret, who returned the hug with equal feeling. "Will you stay for the wedding?" Pearl asked, her whisper a touch louder than usual. "We wouldn't miss it," Margaret assured her, wiping away her own tears. "Oh, Pearl, your mother would be so proud of the young woman you've become." The wedding was set for 4 o'clock as the winter daylight faded. Reverend Thomas had arrived, having made the journey despite the snow-covered roads. The boarding house parlor had been transformed with evergreen boughs and candles, creating a warm, festive atmosphere for the small gathering. Pearl waited in her room, her heart racing with anticipation. A knock at the door revealed Margaret, who had returned to help her prepare. "I brought something," she said, opening a small velvet pouch. "These were your mother's." She withdrew a pair of delicate pearl earrings. "It seems fitting you should wear them today." Pearl accepted the precious gift with trembling hands. As Margaret helped her put them on, she added, "Your Ethan seems like a good man. I had the chance to speak with him earlier." Pearl nodded, smiling. "The best man," she whispered. When it was time for the ceremony, Margaret escorted Pearl downstairs. The small parlor was filled with well-wishers, the boarding house residents, several townsfolk who had become friends, and even Dr. Bennett, who had treated Ethan after the mine accident. Ethan waited by the fireplace, looking handsome and nervous in a new suit. When he saw Pearl, his face transformed with such joy and love that her heart seemed to expand in her chest. As she reached him, taking his offered hands, Pearl felt a certainty she had never known before. This man, this place, this moment, this was where she belonged. Reverend Thomas began the ceremony, his voice solemn yet warm as he spoke of the commitment they were making. When it came time for their vows, Ethan spoke as clearly and with deep emotion, promising to love, honor, and cherish Pearl all the days of his life. Then it was Pearl's turn. She took a deep breath, her eyes locked with Ethan's. In that moment, all her fear fell away, replaced by the strength of her love for him. "I, Pearl," she began, her voice clear and steady, audible to everyone in the room, "take you, Ethan, to be my husband." A ripple of surprise moved through the gathering, and Ethan's eyes widened with joyful amazement. Pearl continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, as she promised to love and cherish him in sickness and in health, for as long as they both should live. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Ethan squeezed her hands, his own eyes shining with tears of joy. "You found your voice," he whispered, for her ears alone. "You gave me the courage," she replied, no longer whispering. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of happiness. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan pulled Pearl into a tender kiss, sealing their commitment amid cheers and applause from their friends. At the small reception that followed, Pearl surprised everyone again by thanking their guests in her clear, newfound voice. Though still soft, it carried easily through the room, no longer the bare whisper she had been reduced to for so many years. "It's a Christmas miracle," Mrs. Holloway declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Never thought I'd hear that girl speak above a whisper." Later, as Ethan and Pearl prepared to leave for their new home, Margaret approached them with her husband, Thomas. "We'll be staying in Mineral Park for a few weeks," she told them. "We'd love to get to know you both better if you're amenable." "We'd like that very much," Pearl replied, her voice confident in a way she hadn't thought possible just months before. As they drove the short distance to their cabin in a borrowed wagon, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down in the lantern light. Ethan wrapped an arm around Pearl, tucking the blankets more securely around them. "Happy, Mrs. Quincy?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "Very," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I never imagined I could be this happy." Their cabin welcomed them with the warmth of the fire Ethan had lit earlier, the small space transformed into a cozy haven against the winter night. As they stood together in the home he had built for them, Pearl felt the last of her old fears melt away. "I love you, Ethan," she said, her clear voice filling the room. "Thank you for helping me find myself again." Ethan cupped her face gently in his hands. "I love you too, Pearl. Your voice is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, but even in your silence you spoke to my heart." Their kiss sealed the beginning of their new life together, a life where Pearl's voice would grow stronger each day, filling their home with the words and eventually the laughter she had been denied for so long. Spring came early to the Arizona Territory in 1882. By March, the land around Ethan and Pearl's cabin had begun to green, and Ethan was busy preparing the soil for their first garden. Pearl divided her time between their home and occasional work at the boarding house, where Mrs. Holloway had insisted on keeping her on for 2 days a week, until you get properly settled. Margaret and her husband had returned to St. Louis after a month in Mineral Park, but had left with promises of future visits and regular correspondence. Their presence in Pearl's life had helped heal old wounds, providing a connection to her parents and her past that she had thought lost forever. On a warm April afternoon, Pearl was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Shading her eyes against the sun, she saw Ethan returning from town earlier than expected, his horse at a canter rather than his usual easy pace. "Pearl," he called as he dismounted, excitement evident in his voice. "I've got news." She met him halfway across the yard, her heart quickening at his enthusiasm. "What is it?" "The railroad company has offered me a permanent position," he announced, taking her hands in his. "Supervisor for the entire western Arizona section. It means I'll be based here, overseeing the work rather than traveling all the time. "Oh, Ethan, that's wonderful," Pearl exclaimed, her voice ringing clear with joy. "You've worked so hard for this." "There's more," he continued, his eyes bright. "With the salary they're offering, we can expand the house, maybe buy more land." And he paused, suddenly looking a bit nervous. "I thought maybe it might be time to think about starting a family. If you're ready, that is." Pearl's smile widened. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "In fact, I've been wanting to tell you." She took a deep breath, hardly believing she was finally saying the words aloud. "I believe we're already going to have a child come winter." Ethan stared at her for a moment, his expression shifting from surprise to wonder to absolute joy. "A baby." "Really?" When Pearl nodded, he let out a whoop that could probably be heard all the way to town, lifting her off her feet in a gentle spin before setting her back down with utmost care. "Are you sure? How long have you known?" he asked, his hands moving protectively to her still flat stomach. "I've suspected for a few weeks," Pearl replied. "Mrs. Holloway confirmed it for me yesterday. She's known more than her share of expectant mothers." Ethan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A baby," he repeated in awe. "Our child." "Our child," Pearl echoed, her voice steady and full of the confidence she had reclaimed in the months since their wedding. That evening, as they sat on their small porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan placed his arm around Pearl's shoulders. "I've been thinking about names," he said. Pearl laughed, a sound that still delighted Ethan every time he heard it. "Already? We have months yet." "Never too early to start considering," he replied with a smile. "If it's a girl, what would you think of naming her after your mother?" Pearl's eyes softened with emotion. "Elizabeth," she said quietly. "I'd like that very much." "And if it's a boy," Ethan prompted. Pearl considered for a moment. "What about James, after your father?" Ethan nodded, clearly touched by her suggestion. "James Quincy has a fine sound to it." As darkness fell, they remained on the porch, talking of their hopes and dreams for their growing family. Pearl's voice, though still softer than most, rose and fell with the natural cadence of a woman no longer afraid to be heard. Later that night, as they lay together in their bed, Ethan placed his hand gently on Pearl's abdomen. "I can hardly believe it," he murmured. "A year ago, I was just a solitary surveyor with no real home, and now I have you, this place, and a child on the way." Pearl covered his hand with her own. "A year ago, I could barely speak above a whisper," she reminded him. "You changed everything for me, Ethan." "No," he corrected gently. "You had the strength all along. You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself again." Throughout the summer, Pearl's body changed as their child grew within her. Her morning sickness, thankfully mild, passed by the end of June, and with it came a renewed energy. She threw herself into preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and furnishing the small second room of their cabin as a nursery. Ethan, true to his word, began expanding their home, adding a larger kitchen and a covered porch that wrapped around the south side of the cabin to capture the winter sun and summer shade. The railroad position kept him busy but allowed him to be home most nights, a blessing Pearl didn't take for granted. In late August, they received a letter from Margaret, announcing her intention to visit when the baby arrived. "I wouldn't miss welcoming the newest member of our family," she wrote. "Besides, every new mother needs someone who knows what they're doing to help in those first weeks." As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, Pearl found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this place of happiness. The fear and pain of her years with her uncle had not disappeared entirely. There were still nights when she woke from nightmares, her voice momentarily lost, but those episodes grew rarer as time passed. More often, She found joy in the simple pleasure of using her voice, singing to the child within her, calling to Ethan across their land, even engaging in friendly conversation with townsfolk who had once known her only as the quiet girl from the boarding house. December brought colder weather and the final preparations for the baby's arrival. Dr. Bennett visited regularly now, assuring them that everything was progressing normally. "Strong heartbeat," he commented during one examination. "Active, too. You've got a lively one in there, Mrs. Quincy." Pearl laughed as the baby kicked, as if to confirm the doctor's assessment. "Lively indeed," she agreed, "especially at night when I'm trying to sleep." As their first wedding anniversary approached, Pearl insisted on preparing a special dinner despite Ethan's concerns about her overexerting herself. "The baby isn't due for at least 2 more weeks," she reminded him, "and I want to celebrate properly." On Christmas Eve, with their cabin festive with evergreen boughs and candles, Pearl served the dinner she had spent the day preparing. They ate by firelight, reminiscing about their wedding day and all that had happened in the year since. "I have something for you," Ethan said afterward, retrieving a package from the shelf where he'd hidden it. "An anniversary gift." Pearl unwrapped the parcel carefully, revealing a beautiful leather-bound journal. Opening it, she found the pages blank except for an inscription on the first page in Ethan's handwriting. "For Pearl, whose voice has become the music of our home. May these pages hold the stories you once couldn't tell, and the dreams we'll build together." Tears welled in Pearl's eyes as she looked up at her husband. "It's perfect," she said, her voice clear with emotion. "I've been thinking lately about writing down my story, not just the painful parts, but everything. For our child and maybe someday for others who have been silenced." Ethan smiled, understanding as always. "Your story deserves to be told, Pearl, and you tell it so beautifully now." Pearl was about to respond when she felt a sharp pain that took her breath away. Her hand went instinctively to her abdomen. "Pearl," Ethan's voice sharpened with concern. "What is it?" "I think," she said, breathing carefully as the pain subsided, "that our anniversary gift from this little one might be an early arrival." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Ethan rode for Dr. Bennett while a neighbor woman came to help Pearl. By the time the doctor arrived, Pearl's labor was well established, her contractions coming steadily. "Looks like this baby is determined to share your anniversary," Dr. Bennett commented as he examined her. "Everything's progressing well. First babies usually take their time, though, so we might be here a while." But the child, like its mother, seemed determined to find its voice in the world sooner rather than later. As the first light of Christmas Day began to brighten the eastern sky, Pearl gave a final push and was rewarded with the indignant cry of her newborn son. "A fine, healthy boy," Dr. Bennett announced, placing the swaddled infant in Pearl's arms after checking him thoroughly. "Congratulations to you both." Pearl looked down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed with a love so powerful it took her breath away. "James," she whispered, then more strongly, "James Ethan Quincy. Welcome to the world, little one." Ethan sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Pearl, his expression one of wonder as he gazed at his son. "He's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just perfect." As James settled against her chest, his cries subsiding as he found security in his mother's arms, Pearl felt a sense of completion she had never imagined possible. The journey from the terrified, silent young woman who had arrived in Mineral Park to the confident, vocal mother she had become seemed both immeasurably long and astonishingly short. "I love you," she said to Ethan, her voice clear and strong despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for everything you've given me." "I love you too," he replied, gently touching their son's tiny hand, Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." As the first full day of James's life unfolded, visitors came to meet the Christmas baby, Mrs. Holloway, bearing food and practical advice, neighbors with small gifts, even the other surveyors stopping by to congratulate Ethan and see the newest resident of Mineral Park. Pearl received them all with a grace and warmth that would have astonished those who had known her only a year before. Her voice, though still naturally soft, carried easily through the cabin as she thanked each visitor and proudly introduced her son. That evening, as the winter darkness fell early and a gentle snow began outside their windows, Pearl sat in the rocking chair Ethan had made for her, nursing James. Ethan knelt beside them, watching his son with evident pride. "You remember what you said to me that day at the mine?" Pearl asked suddenly. "When you were injured and I was so worried." Ethan shook his head. "I was pretty addled from that knock on the head. What did I say?" "You said you dreamed of hearing my voice grow stronger," Pearl recalled, "of hearing me laugh someday, even shout if the occasion called for it." She smiled down at their son, then back at her husband. "I think you got your wish." Ethan returned her smile. "That I did. Though I'm still waiting for the shouting." "Give me time," Pearl laughed softly. "With this little one around, I'm sure there will be occasions enough." As James drifted to sleep at her breast, Pearl gazed around their home at the Christmas greenery, the flickering firelight, the sturdy walls Ethan had built, and the man himself, watching her with such love in his eyes. She thought of how far she had come from the frightened, silent girl who had arrived in Mineral Park with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for safety. She had found so much more than safety. She had found her voice, her strength, her family, both in the husband who had believed in her from the start and now in the child sleeping peacefully in her arms. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Pearl smiled, her voice clear and unwavering as she replied, "I'm thinking that I've never been happier than I am right now in this moment with you and James. And I'm thinking how grateful I am that I found the courage to speak again, so I can tell you both how much I love you every day for the rest of our lives." Ethan leaned forward to kiss her gently. "And we'll never tire of hearing it," he promised. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their small homestead in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in warmth and love, Pearl Ferguson Quincy held her family close, her voice once so fragile and afraid now strong enough to fill their home with all the words she had once been forced to keep silent, and all the joy she had never dared to hope for. In the years that followed, the Quincy homestead flourished. Ethan's position with the railroad provided stability, while their expanding farm yielded enough surplus to sell in town. James grew from a determined infant into a sturdy toddler with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's curious nature. When James was 2, Pearl gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Elizabeth. The house expanded again to accommodate their growing family, with Ethan adding 2 more rooms and improving the water system from the nearby spring. Pearl's voice grew stronger with each passing year. She began teaching at the small schoolhouse in Mineral Park when James started his education, her soft but clear voice guiding a generation of children through their letters and numbers. The townspeople who had once known her only as the silent girl from the boarding house now sought her thoughtful counsel and quiet wisdom. On summer evenings, neighbors would often gather at the Quincy home, drawn by Pearl's warm hospitality and Ethan's easy humor. During these gatherings, if one listened carefully, they might hear Pearl's laugh ring out bright and joyful, no longer constrained by fear. And occasionally, when the situation warranted, like the time 4-year-old Thomas nearly rode the family horse unattended. They might even hear her shout. Each time she raised her voice, whether in laughter, song, or necessary admonishment, Ethan would catch her eye across the room and smile, both of them remembering the whispered beginnings of their love story and marveling at how far they had come together.